When I asked my son Julian about the grand opening of his high-end custom architecture firm's showcase villa, a business I single-handedly bankrolled with my entire life, savings of $1.2 million, his wife Chloe let out a soft, incredibly condescending sigh on the other end of the line. She told me the grand opening had actually happened 6 weeks ago. She said they only invited a very select group of top-tier investors and local politicians because it was an exclusive high society circle, and my vibe just didn't really fit that kind of event. I didn't scream into the phone, and I didn't immediately demand my money back. I just calmly hung up. A few days later, she called me back in an absolute panic because the bills from several core material suppliers were severely overdue. She demanded, in a tone that sounded more like an interrogation, that I immediately wire over the Phase 2 backup working capital. I just smiled, looked down at the commercial foreclosure and asset seizure paperwork already sitting on my heavy mahogany desk, and said softly, "I thought you only discussed financial matters with your exclusive elite." Before we get further into this story, please drop a comment below and let me know what city you are listening from. If you have ever had to teach an ungrateful relative a lesson they will never forget, please hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 62 years old, and my hands are still covered in thick, rough calluses. They are the permanent marks of a man who spent 40 years grinding his way up from the absolute bottom in the oil field logistics and heavy machinery industries of Houston, Texas. I built a massive heavy equipment rental and industrial warehousing empire during those brutal, suffocating Texas summers. I drove the heavy rigs myself, and I backed my opponents into corners during cutthroat business negotiations. I didn't inherit a single penny from anyone. Everything I own was built on 80-hour work weeks and nerves of steel. 5 years ago, when my beloved wife passed away from an illness, the silence in my empty country estate became deafening. I naively thought that if I poured all my energy, resources, and unconditional love into our only son, Julian, it would fill that suffocating void. Julian was a newly licensed high-end architect. He was a boy born at the finish line who spent his entire adult life genuinely believing he had run the marathon to get there. I made sure he never had to work those grueling summer jobs in the 100-degree Texas heat. I paid his expensive Ivy League architecture tuition in full, making sure he would never know the crushing weight of student loans that break so many young people. That was my first and most fatal mistake. Absolute comfort breeds a very specific kind of weakness, along with a deep-seated, incredibly dangerous sense of entitlement. His wife, Chloe, was the perfect embodiment of that weakness. The exact moment I agreed to fund their architecture firm, Chloe appointed herself chief operating officer. Her financial literacy was that of a spoiled toddler, yet she possessed a massive vanity that required non-stop luxury to maintain. Whenever they came back to my ranch estate for dinner on weekends, she would look at my faded denim shirts and dirt-stained old leather boots with pure, undisguised disgust. She didn't see me as a grieving father. She saw me as a crude, blue-collar fossil who just happened to hold the golden key to their high society lifestyle. I put up with her endless passive-aggressive digs. I pretended not to notice Julian mindlessly scrolling through his phone whenever I tried to offer him solid business advice. I truly believed that my final financial sacrifice would secure his professional career and keep our broken family together. I made a massive decision and liquidated a core business asset. I sold a highly lucrative, industrial heavy storage yard near the port of Houston that I had owned for 15 years, all so I could hand them a cashier's check for $1.2 million. That money had very strict guidelines. It was meant for leasing high-end office space in downtown Austin, launching their initial brand marketing, and buying expensive engineering survey equipment, design workstations, and their first batch of premium construction materials. Because I am a businessman at heart, I had my lawyer draft a 120-page master financing agreement for the LLC structuring the funds as a senior commercial loan with priority secured rights. I placed that thick stack of paperwork right in front of them, but they were completely blinded by the zeros on the check. They didn't look at a single one of the first 119 pages. They flipped straight to the very last page and signed their names on every single signature line. The only thing they cared about was how fast that massive fortune would clear into their bank account. For 3 long months, they kept telling me that their first major project, a custom-built showcase villa for a Silicon Valley tech mogul, was heavily delayed because of Austin's strict environmental permits and complicated supply chain issues. Then came a Friday evening when I decided to drive out to that wealthy Austin neighborhood myself to check on the progress of this landmark building. I fully expected to see clouds of sawdust, exposed structural steel beams, and exhausted construction crews working overtime. I parked my old but reliable Ford pickup truck about half a block away from the villa. As I walked toward the property, I didn't see any of the messy chaos of a construction site. What I saw was a fully completed, incredibly modern mansion made of panoramic glass and steel, with high-end landscape lighting illuminating the front. Parked prominently in the expensive stone driveway was a brand-new, matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. The shiny custom license plate bore Chloe's initials. The front doors of the villa were wide open, smooth jazz music drifted outside, and the air conditioning carried the scent of expensive champagne and high-end truffles. The massive first-floor living room, which looked like a top-tier art gallery, was packed with glamorous, well-dressed people. A private security guard in a tailored suit stood behind a velvet rope at the entrance, politely but coldly asking if I was on the VIP guest list. I asked him what time the grand opening inside had started. He gave me a professional smile and told me they had already been celebrating in there for a full 3 hours. I looked through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I saw my son, Julian, wearing a custom Italian suit, raising a glass and laughing with several tech CEOs. I saw Chloe wearing a dazzling diamond necklace, posing for photos in the middle of a crowd of wealthy influencers. I could have walked right past the guard and ignored him entirely. But at that exact moment, I noticed a terrifying detail. My eyes, which had been trained by 40 years in construction and heavy industry, immediately went to work. I saw the main load-bearing steel beams supporting the massive cantilevered terrace. On the side of that beam, there was a highly visible yellow asset tag. It was a standard rental label from a third-party construction equipment leasing company. I quickly scanned the expensive smart home control hub and the holographic projection layout system setup in the corner, and they all carried the exact same rental tags. This was absolutely impossible. A $1.2 million investment was more than enough to buy every single piece of premium, raw material, and core equipment needed for this model home in cash, with plenty left over to cover their company's operating costs for a whole year. But they hadn't bought any of it. They had used incredibly expensive short-term lease agreements to rent all the core components just to maintain a fake cash flow on the company books. They had intentionally misallocated my life savings to buy a luxury SUV, order expensive diamonds, throw this ridiculous champagne party, and even pay themselves outrageously high, unearned salaries before a single paying client had signed a contract. 他们拿走了我一生的心血，把它变成了一场钱波而滑稽的财富戏剧。I didn't say a single word to the security guard. I turned around and walked back to my old truck. A cold, dark realization seeped deep into my aging bones. I drove all the way back to my empty estate in Houston in dead silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I walked straight into my private study and sat down at the wooden desk, where I had once fiercely negotiated multi-million-dollar industrial contracts with the coldest businessmen in the city. I picked up my phone and dialed Julian's personal number. He didn't answer. The call forwarded automatically to the architecture firm's main office line, and Chloe picked up. When she spoke the pretentious name of their high-end design company, her voice was bright and sickeningly artificial. I skipped the small talk. I simply asked my son's wife about the grand opening of the villa I had funded. I asked why I hadn't been invited to watch my son cut the ribbon and celebrate his success. I heard her sharp intake of breath perfectly, but a split second later, her deep-seated arrogance returned to mask her panic. She let out that soft sigh I had grown to absolutely despise. "Oh, the grand opening was an internal event 6 weeks ago, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with highly rehearsed, fake apology. "We only invited a very select group of top investors and potential clients tonight. You know how it is, it's an exclusive high society circle." Those heavy words hung in the stagnant air of my study. An exclusive circle. The man who had sold a massive piece of his own soul to foot the bill for their fake reality wasn't even qualified to step through the front door. I was just a silent ATM. And ATMs are never invited to the after party. In less than a single second, the lingering grief of a father desperately craving his son's love completely evaporated. The warmth of fatherly love left my body, replaced by a familiar, glacier-like clarity that I hadn't felt since the days when I ruthlessly tore apart terrible business investments. I didn't scream at her through the phone. I didn't list the endless sacrifices I had made for my son. I didn't demand my $1.2 million back. I just hung up. I set the phone down on the polished wooden desk and folded my hands. Julian and Chloe truly believed they had effortlessly outsmarted a stubborn, irrelevant old man. They thought they could drain my accounts and throw me into the shadows, because they had foolishly mistaken a father's silence and patience for pathetic weakness. They had completely forgotten exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The grieving, hopeful father died right there in that leather office chair, but the cold, ruthless businessman who built an empire out of mud and steel woke up. I slowly opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the 120-page contract that they had been too arrogant and greedy to even glance at. It was time to show my son and his wife exactly what happens when you decide to steal from a man who knows how to legally write the rules of destruction. I didn't call my son back. I didn't drive through the night to their expensive rented luxury apartment to demand an explanation or scream until my throat went hoarse. Anger is an incredibly useless emotion that only tips off your enemy to your next move. I simply picked up the heavy manila envelope containing that 120-page master financing agreement, walked out of the quiet house, and climbed into the driver's seat of my old pickup truck. The engine roared to life with a heavy mechanical rumble that perfectly matched the cold, hard rhythm beating in my chest. I backed out of the driveway and pointed the truck toward the downtown Houston financial district. My destination was the law offices of Marcus Vance. Marcus was an incredibly cold-blooded commercial litigator who had successfully won every single commercial legal war for me over the past 30 years. As I drove down the crowded interstate, my mind drifted back to the economic crash that wiped out half of the independent energy and real estate developers in Texas. That was a brutal, miserable time. I watched proud, wealthy men lose their massive mansions, their luxury cars, and their life savings in a matter of weeks. I watched lifelong friendships burn to ash over unpaid debts and broken promises. I watched men I deeply respected get backed into a corner and ruin because they trusted a handshake and a gentleman's agreement instead of relying on ironclad legal paperwork. I survived that horrific economic slaughter for one very specific reason. When big money is on the line, I never trust a soul. I protect my assets with incredibly complex, unforgiving contracts. I learned the hard way that when money gets involved, blood relations and friendly smiles mean absolutely nothing. That brutal lesson is the exact reason why I didn't just write a simple check and hand $1.2 million over to my son. When Julian and Chloe first pitched their business plan to me, they treated this massive capital request like a casual family favor. They showed up with an expensive bottle of wine, completely confident as they asked me to fund their dream, acting like they were just asking me to pick up the tab for dinner. I agreed to provide the funding, but I forced them to sit down at my dining room table and formalize the investment structure with Marcus Vance present. I remember that evening vividly. Chloe showed an obvious irritated boredom with a thick stack of legal documents sitting in front of her. She rolled her eyes and complained that families shouldn't need this much paperwork. Julian just laughed nervously, joking that his old man was just overly paranoid about his retirement fund. They were so incredibly desperate to get their hands on the cash that they flipped straight to the last page and signed their names on the dotted line, without reading a single word of the first 119 pages. They had absolutely no clue what they were signing. They didn't realize that the 120-page document was actually a legally binding senior secured loan agreement heavily disguised as standard operating bylaws. They didn't know that by signing it, they had granted me a comprehensive first priority lien on absolutely every single asset their architecture firm would ever own. Every dollar flowing through their business account, the intellectual property of every blueprint, every client deposit, and even the luxury leather chairs in their fancy office belonged legally to me, and me alone, until that loan was paid back in full with interest. I pulled my truck into the underground garage of Marcus Vance's high-rise office building. I walked through the sleek modern lobby and took the elevator straight to the top floor. The receptionist recognized me instantly and led me right into Marcus's massive corner office overlooking the city skyline. Marcus was sitting behind his spotless glass desk, reviewing a complex merger file. He was a tall, sharp man who dealt strictly in facts, calculating every possible legal outcome before he even opened his mouth. He looked up from his paperwork, saw the completely dead expression in my eyes, and instantly recognized the thick manila envelope in my hand. He knew in a heartbeat that the grieving, hopeful father was dead, and the cold industrial tycoon was back. Marcus stood up, closed his office door, and asked me what happened. I didn't waste any time complaining about feelings or crying dramatic tears. I slammed that heavy contract down on his glass desk and told him that the high-end custom architecture firm had been fully operational for 6 weeks. I told him I was completely excluded from the grand opening and that my daughter-in-law was now panicking because she couldn't pay the construction suppliers. Then I hit him with the kicker. I told him that every single core structural beam and high-tech smart appliance inside that expensive showcase villa was rented from a third-party leasing company. Marcus slowly opened the manila envelope and pulled out the signed operating agreement. He adjusted his glasses and flipped straight to Section 7, Paragraph C. He read the clause out loud in the quiet room. The clause explicitly stated that the $1.2 million injection was strictly restricted capital. The law mandated that this money had to be used to purchase construction equipment and core raw materials outright, serving as full collateral to secure the senior loan. By choosing to lease the building materials and diverting my restricted funds to buy a luxury SUV, pay fake consulting fees, and cut bloated personal paychecks, Julian and Chloe had committed a severe material breach of core financial covenants. They weren't just disrespecting me as a father. Legally, they had committed major commercial fraud against a secured creditor. Marcus looked up from the contract and asked me how I wanted to handle it. He offered to draft a formal warning letter demanding immediate compliance and a full audit of the remaining funds. He suggested we could freeze their corporate bank accounts today to stop the financial bleeding. I shook my head and completely shut down both of his logical suggestions. Sending a warning letter would only give them precious time to hide the remaining cash or try to apply for a fraudulent bridge loan to cover their tracks. Freezing the accounts today would tip them off that I was fully onto them. I didn't want to warn them. I wanted to quietly build an absolute, inescapable financial cage around them while they were still drunk on the illusion of their own toxic arrogance. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against greedy people, because a greedy person will always mistake your silence for stupid submission. I instructed Marcus to keep all his next moves completely undercover. I ordered him to use the absolute legal authority granted to me under Section 12 of the operating agreement to launch a secret forensic accounting audit of their corporate accounts immediately. I wanted to know where every single cent of my $1.2 million went. I wanted to see the hidden payouts. I wanted to see the luxury car payments. And I wanted the exact names of the construction suppliers they were currently stiffing. Marcus nodded slowly, fully understanding the devastating strategy I was laying out. He warned me that initiating this secret legal process meant crossing a red line that we could never walk back. He reminded me that once we weaponized this contract against my own son, there would be no going back to Sunday family dinners or decent holiday gatherings. I looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city below. I thought about the light blue dress my late wife would have worn to that party if she were still alive. I thought about the condescending tone Chloe used when she told me I wasn't invited. That line had already been crossed by them weeks ago. I was just preparing total annihilation for the people standing on the other side of it. I told Marcus to run the audit immediately and to contact me the exact second he found the unpaid supplier invoices. I turned and walked out of his beautiful office, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had at any point in the last 5 years. The heavy emotional baggage of trying to buy my son's love with money was finally gone forever. In its place was the clean, pure, geometric beauty of a perfectly executed legal contract. Julian and Chloe thought they had successfully stolen my retirement to fund their glamorous fake life. They were about to find out they had just personally financed their own absolute destruction. The secret forensic audit launched early the next morning in total secrecy. Marcus didn't hire ordinary accountants to check the books. He brought in a former federal tax investigator, a heavy hitter who specialized in dismantling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden assets. Because that 120-page operating agreement gave me absolute, unilateral authorization as the primary secured creditor, Marcus was able to quietly serve a strict legal notice to the commercial bank holding the design firm's accounts. The bank was legally obligated to cooperate with a first priority line holder, and they immediately turned over every transaction record, wire transfer, and credit card statement tied to the architecture company. Julian and Chloe were completely blind to this massive financial invasion. They were too busy posing for photos inside their luxury rented showcase home, completely unaware that the silent old man they threw away like garbage was currently drawing up the exact blueprint for their financial execution. 3 days later, Marcus's call came through to my private cell, calmly asking me to come back to his office. He told me the investigator had finished compiling the data and that I needed to see the results for myself. The weather outside was intensely humid, with a textbook Texas thunderstorm brewing over the city skyline. As I drove back downtown, the oppressive atmosphere perfectly matched the absolute stillness in my chest. I walked into Marcus's corner office and saw a massive binder sitting perfectly centered on his glass desk. The investigator had categorized every single dime of my $1.2 million investment. I sat down in the leather chair, and Marcus opened the binder. He didn't offer any comforting words or sympathetic apologies. He knew I only cared about cold, undeniable facts. Marcus started by explaining my son's actions. He turned to the section detailing daily client logs and projected revenue streams. Julian was working incredibly hard. His schedule was packed from early morning until late at night with high society meetings, but the financial numbers made absolutely no sense. Despite a massive volume of high net worth client interest, the actual realized gross revenue was horrifyingly low. Marcus pointed to the billing records and explained exactly what my son was doing. Julian was desperately trying to build a reputation as an elite architect among Austin's tech elite, local celebrities, and wealthy internet influencers. Instead of running the firm like a profitable business, he was treating it like a vanity project to boost his own social standing. He was giving these wealthy people outrageous discounts, even handing over tens of thousands of dollars in free custom blueprints and preliminary consulting, just to be invited to their private yacht parties, or to get his name tagged in their social media posts. He completely ignored the accounting software and refused to look at the daily cash burn reports. He just walked into his high-end rented office every day, put on his tailored casual suits, and played the part of a wildly successful architectural prodigy while his business was actually bleeding to death in the dark. Julian's foolish vanity was deeply disappointing, but it was nothing compared to the calculated predatory greed of his wife. Marcus slowly turned the page to the company's operational budget, and the air in the room instantly turned to ice. Chloe wasn't just a terrible chief operating officer. She was actively and systematically embezzling my retirement fund. Marcus pointed his pen at a long string of massive weekly wire transfers. These transfers weren't paying for building supplies or engineering crews. They were being routed directly to an outside shell entity called Aura Curations LLC. Marcus had the investigator dig deep into the state registry data to find the incorporation documents for this mystery vendor. The results were sickening. Aura Curations was a shadow, LLC, registered just 2 months ago under Chloe's maiden name. She was the sole managing member and the only authorized signer on the receiving bank account. She was billing her husband's architecture firm over $50,000 a month for services that were completely fabricated. The descriptions on the invoices were laughable. She was charging the company massive fees for things like high society brand synergy consulting, elite audience spatial marketing, and atmospheric sensory management. It was a textbook, sophisticated money laundering scheme. She was using her position as COO to approve these massive fake invoices and wire my secured loan principal straight into her personal bank account. Marcus spread out Chloe's personal bank statements, which the investigator had legally obtained through financial tracing protocols. I sat there in dead silence, watching exactly how my daughter-in-law had squandered the hard-earned cash I had made pouring concrete in freezing rain. I saw the massive down payment for the matte black G-Wagon. I saw thousands of dollars spent weekly at high-end luxury clothing boutiques. I saw the bills for lavish weekend getaways to Aspen ski resorts and invoices for expensive imported jewelry. She was burning through my cash at a terrifying, reckless speed, blindly believing that this endless stream of money would never dry up. She truly thought she had found the perfect mark in her quiet, aging father-in-law. I looked up from the documents and asked Marcus what this actually meant for the current stability of the design firm. Marcus flipped to the very last tab of the binder to show me the disastrous consequences of Chloe's non-stop theft. Because she had been frantically draining their primary operational cash to fund her fake consulting company and maintain her lavish lifestyle, there was absolutely zero money left in the account to pay basic, legitimate business expenses. The forensic investigator had flagged over 24 overdue payment notices from major construction suppliers. These were the critical vendors keeping the project alive, the ones providing the structural steel, the custom impact glass, and the premium timber needed to build that rented showcase mansion. Chloe had completely ignored their invoices just to ensure her own fraudulent consulting fees were paid first. She was starving the actual construction business to feed her boundless vanity. Marcus explained that the company was currently running on borrowed time. Several core suppliers had already issued final warnings. Within a matter of weeks, they were going to completely cut off the supply chain and file legal mechanics liens against the property. Without those core building materials, it would be physically impossible for Julian to finish any of his projects. He would be forced to default on those high-profile Silicon Valley clients, and the fragile, wealthy reputation he was desperately trying to build would completely collapse overnight. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed his hands. He told me that the ironclad evidence we now held was more than enough to immediately freeze all of the firm's accounts, contact federal authorities, and have Chloe arrested on the spot for major financial fraud and embezzlement of secured funds. He explained that her actions violated multiple state and federal laws regarding the misappropriation of secured corporate capital. He was fully prepared to draw up the legal complaints and completely destroy her world before the sun went down. I stared at the binder and slowly closed the cover. I shook my head and told Marcus to hold off on the legal charges for now. Arresting Chloe today was too easy, and it would completely ruin the lesson I needed to teach them. If I shut them down today, Julian would just play the innocent victim. He would look at me with those well-rehearsed puppy dog eyes, swear he knew absolutely nothing about his wife's criminal activities, and beg for my forgiveness, demanding another financial bailout to save his precious reputation. I refused to let him escape his own chosen ignorance. He chose to marry a parasite, and he chose to ignore his own business just to play the part of a high society hotshot. They needed to feel the absolute crushing weight of the trap they had built for themselves. I instructed Marcus to keep the accounts fully open and let Chloe continue her fraudulent wire transfers. I wanted her to feel completely safe and untouchable. I wanted Julian to keep giving away his free blueprints, while the walls quietly closed in on him. But I also knew that when the money finally ran out, I had to have total control over the inevitable fallout. I looked at the list of unpaid construction suppliers, and a brand new strategy started to take shape in my mind. I told Marcus to contact the largest core steel supplier on that overdue list. I told him I wanted to quietly buy out the bad debt Julian's company currently owed them. Marcus let out an incredibly cold, calculating smile. He instantly understood the pure cruelty of this plan. By secretly buying the supplier's debt, I wouldn't just be their primary senior secured investor anymore. I would become their most lethal operational creditor. When Chloe inevitably ran out of stolen money and the steel shipments stopped, she would be forced to desperately beg the supplier for an extension. She would have absolutely no idea the person holding the lifeline to her company was the exact same blue-collar fossil she refused to invite to her grand opening. I stood up from the glass desk and thanked Marcus for his brilliant work. I walked out of the office and took the elevator down to the busy downtown streets. The gloomy thunderstorm was still pouring, but I didn't feel the chill. I felt a deep, powerful rush of absolute control. My son and his wife had stolen my money to build a beautiful glass castle, but they had no idea that I was the one truly holding the sledgehammer in the dark. The next morning, I sat in the quiet study of my country estate, watching the torrential rain wash over the driveway. The thick forensic audit binder was safely locked inside my vault. I knew exactly how much money Chloe was stealing every single week. I knew exactly how my son was playing house in a rented showroom. A weak man would have driven over there immediately, kicked down that fancy glass door, and screamed until his lungs tore. A weak man would have called the police on the spot and watched his daughter-in-law get dragged out in handcuffs. But I didn't want a brief emotional explosion. I wanted a total structural collapse. I decided to let Chloe continue her fraudulent wire transfers. I was going to let that design firm run on the absolute last fumes of gas until the engine finally tore itself to pieces. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. I told him to shelf all the legal complaints and criminal referrals. Instead, I directed his attention back to the forensic audit, specifically to that long list of unpaid vendors. I told him to find the most lethal supplier on that list. I wanted the heavy materials company that provided the load-bearing steel framing, the custom-engineered glass, and the heavy crane equipment, the absolute lifeblood Julian needed to finish that showcase villa. Marcus pulled up the files and immediately locked onto a regional distributor called Texas Core Supply. This company was the absolute heart of Julian's job site. According to the audit, Chloe had completely ignored their invoices for 2 straight months. The design firm currently owed Texas Core Supply over $120,000 in past due balances. Marcus pointed out that the supplier had already sent 2 formal warning letters and was prepared to completely cut off the supply chain and file a lien on the property by the end of the week. I told Marcus to contact the chief financial officer of Texas Core Supply immediately. I instructed him to arrange a private meeting to negotiate buying out my son's corporate debt in its entirety. Marcus paused for a moment on the other end of the line, fully absorbing the cold-blooded nature of this tactic. In the brutal world of real estate, buying distressed commercial debt is incredibly common, but using it against your own flesh and blood was an extraordinarily icy move. By legally purchasing those $120,000 in overdue invoices, I would completely step into the supplier's shoes. In the eyes of the law, I would become the vendor. The execution was incredibly simple and completely fatal. 2 days later, I sat in Marcus's office, watching him finalize the legal debt assignment paperwork with the executives from Texas Core Supply. They were more than happy to offload a toxic client account without having to pay for expensive collection agencies. I cut them a cashier's check for $120,000 from my personal savings. In exchange, they handed over every single legal right, collection authority, and active supply contract tied to Julian's architecture firm. They officially transferred the supplier account under the name of a private holding company completely controlled by me. Julian and Chloe were entirely blind to this massive, invisible shift in power. They would never suspect that the massive, faceless construction materials company they had been ignoring was now fully owned and operated by the aging father they had so easily discarded. I wasn't just the silent investor holding a senior lien on the company anymore. I was now the absolute master of their daily operations. I controlled the steel. I controlled the glass. I controlled the raw materials my son relied on to maintain his fake billionaire lifestyle. Every single time Julian promised a project deadline to his multi-millionaire clients, the materials he depended on belonged to me. Every single time Chloe walked through the procurement sheets, she was looking at inventory that I legally owned. I instructed Marcus to have Texas Core Supply send one final, automated notice to the design firm, formally stating that the account had been sold to a private, third-party management company. Chloe, without a doubt, would ignore this standard commercial notice just like she ignored all the others. She would just throw it in the trash and approve another massive fake wire transfer to her shadow consulting firm, completely unaware that she had just signed her own death warrant. The trap was now perfectly set, with the steel teeth completely hidden beneath the dirt. All I had to do was sit back and wait for the inevitable moment, when the steel on the construction site completely ran out. I knew exactly what would happen. Chloe would panic. She would realize that without paying off that massive past due balance, she couldn't order a single piece of material to keep the job site moving. She would desperately try to call the new vendor holding her debt, begging for an emergency shipment just to keep those wealthy clients from ripping up their contracts. She would have absolutely no clue that the person answering her desperate call for help would be sitting right here behind my heavy mahogany desk. I leaned back in my chair and watched the rain outside slowly stop. For me, the storm was over, but for them, it was just beginning. Exactly 11 days after I bought out the materials company's commercial debt, my private cell phone started vibrating violently against the marble kitchen island. I was calmly pouring my morning black coffee, watching the early news. I glanced down at the glowing screen and saw Chloe's name flashing urgently. The absolute panic I had precisely calculated had finally arrived right on schedule. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee before I even answered the phone. I didn't say hello, I just breathed into the receiver, waiting for her to speak first. Her voice was completely frantic, stripped entirely of the arrogant polish she usually wore like expensive perfume. She didn't bother asking how I was doing, and she didn't apologize for ignoring me for weeks. She immediately launched into a rambling, chaotic story about a major, catastrophic administrative paperwork error on the company's end. She claimed that their primary materials supplier had suddenly and maliciously frozen their purchasing account without any prior warning. She told me that Julian had a highly important Silicon Valley tech mogul scheduled to come out to the showcase villa this afternoon for a final structural inspection, but they currently had absolutely no materials to finish welding the steel frame for the terrace. She explained that the client, who was set to arrive at 2 o'clock, carried massive influence throughout the entire tech community. If Julian was forced to show the client a stalled, half-finished job site due to a lack of basic building materials, that tech giant would completely destroy Julian's reputation as an elite architect before the sun went down. The fragile fake empire they had built with my stolen money was just hours away from a highly public, catastrophic collapse. I listened to her desperate gasping on the other end of the line. I knew for a fact that the materials company had sent her 3 separate automated warnings before cutting off the supply chain. I knew she had completely ignored every single one of them just to prioritize the fraudulent wire transfers to her shadow consulting firm. But I played the part of the ignorant, aging father perfectly. I calmly asked her what exactly she needed me to do. Her desperation instantly mutated back into her deep-seated sense of entitlement. She aggressively demanded that I immediately release the Phase 2 working capital. When we originally drew up that complex loan agreement, I had set aside an optional $150,000 Phase 2 cash injection, strictly reserved for emergency business expansion. The release of those restricted funds was entirely up to my personal, sole discretion. Chloe spoke as if that money already belonged to her. She demanded that I wire the $150,000 into the company's primary account before noon so she could settle this ridiculous supplier dispute and have the building materials delivered immediately by private hotshot trucks. She actually tried to blame the entire situation on the incompetence of the materials company. She swore to me that this was just a temporary cash flow issue because the client's upfront deposits were delayed by bank clearing cycles. It was a pathetic, desperate lie. Julian's only ongoing major project was that single villa, and the client had fully paid all upfront fees before breaking ground. She was lying straight to my face, completely unaware that I was the one holding the past due invoices she was so frantically trying to erase. She paused to catch her breath, and the phone line fell into a dead, heavy silence. She was waiting for the familiar sound of my compliance. She was waiting for the sad, grieving father to instantly cave to her demands, open his wallet, and save his golden boy from total public embarrassment. I let that silence hang there for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted her to feel the heavy, crushing weight of that quiet space. I took another slow sip of my coffee. I looked out the kitchen window at the bright morning light, and I finally spoke. There wasn't a single hint of anger or emotion in my voice. It was the cold, flat tone of a judge delivering a permanent, lifetime sentence. I told her, no. There was a sharp, loud gasp on the other end. Chloe stammered, completely blindsided by that one single word. She immediately found her voice, raising her pitch and demanding to know what I meant. She reminded me that Julian was my only son, and that his entire elite reputation was on the line today. She told me that if he defaulted on a high-net-worth client like this, his design firm would be ruined forever. She demanded to know why I was suddenly being so unreasonable and cold-hearted in the middle of a massive business emergency. I just smiled, keeping my eyes fixed on the foreclosure paperwork, still sitting quietly on my heavy mahogany desk. I fired the exact words back at her through the phone that she had used to humiliate me just weeks before. I told her, I thought you only discussed financial matters with your exclusive elite. The absolute silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 5 years. I could practically hear the gears in her head grinding and shattering as she realized her own toxic words were being weaponized and aimed directly back at her. She instantly tried to backpedal. Her voice dropped into a pathetic, whining apology, claiming I had completely misunderstood what she meant about the grand opening that night. She started crying, begging me to just wire the cash, promising that the family could all sit down for a nice dinner this weekend and talk everything through. She was trying to trade a cheap fake dinner for $150,000. She was trying to buy back her survival using the counterfeit affection she had coldly denied me for years. I didn't let her finish her pathetic pitch. I told her that due to gross operational mismanagement, the Phase 2 funding was permanently canceled. I told her that since she was such a brilliant chief operating officer, She would just have to figure out how to pay those past due bills herself, without relying on a crude, blue-collar fossil. Before she could scream, beg, or threaten me, I calmly ended the call. I powered down the phone, completely severing their only remaining lifeline to my bank account. The illusion of endless family funding was officially dead. I walked back into my study and sat down in the heavy leather chair. Chloe and Julian were completely isolated now. They had no building materials. They had no backup funds. And they had absolutely no clue that the monster slowly grinding their business to dust was the exact same father they had so casually thrown away. The real, unadulterated panic was about to begin. I flipped my phone face down on the heavy mahogany desk and walked into the kitchen to pour another cup of black coffee. The house was dead quiet, but in my mind I could already hear the absolute chaos erupting across town at my son's luxury design firm. I didn't need hidden cameras to see the disaster unfolding. I had spent 40 years in the brutal trenches of business, and I knew exactly how a severely undercapitalized vanity project collapses the second the artificial oxygen is completely cut off. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and waited for the inevitable digital explosion. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, the Silicon Valley tech mogul arrived at the Showcase Villa site for his highly anticipated structural inspection. I knew this schedule inside and out because Marcus had the forensic investigator quietly monitoring the design firm's public calendar. This tech giant wasn't just incredibly demanding. His inner circle included more than half of the potential high-net-worth clients in Austin. Julian had foolishly promised him that afternoon that he would showcase the fully completed structural steel framing for the cantilevered terrace, even inviting professional commercial photographers to document the moment for his luxury design website. The client stepped into that panoramic glass building, fully expecting a top-tier, elite walkthrough. Julian was waiting inside in his tailored suit, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had entirely bankrupted his supply chain. He confidently guided the client toward the unfinished terrace area, even handing the man a glass of expensive champagne. Then he walked over to the staging area where the load-bearing steel and high-tech welding equipment were supposed to be stacked. At that exact moment, his fake billionaire reality was violently shattered. To complete that core showcase piece, Julian absolutely needed that specific shipment of highly customized structural steel and specialized high-strength fasteners. Those were the exact raw materials exclusively supplied by the vendor I now secretly owned. Julian stepped up to the staging area expecting a massive inventory layout, only to find the space completely empty, save for a few discarded rolls of electrical tape. Then the underwriter brought up the equipment. He brutally chewed her out for attempting to leverage high-tech surveying instruments as loan collateral. He told her his legal team had already spoken with the major vendors holding the equipment leases. He informed her that pledging leased corporate assets was a severe federal offense, and he was legally obligated to report her fraudulent loan application to the National Commercial Fraud Registry. He told her that no reputable bank or alternative institution in the country would ever lend her a single dime again. Chloe was completely paralyzed. The heavy phone shook in her perfectly manicured nails. Her entire arrogant reality was being violently demolished around her. For months, she had treated me like a pathetic, irrelevant old fool. She mocked my worn-out clothes and sneered at my quiet demeanor. She truly believed she had effortlessly stolen my life savings to build her glamorous empire. Now, a stranger on the phone was aggressively explaining to her that she was nothing more than a temporary, unwelcome squatter sitting in a financial fortress that I personally built for her. Her voice dropped to a terrified whisper. She asked the underwriter who exactly held this massive senior lien. She desperately prayed it was some massive, faceless banking conglomerate that she could somehow beg or negotiate with. The underwriter read the name clearly off the state registry documents. He told her that the senior lien holder, the absolute owner of her entire business, was a private commercial holding company completely controlled by a man named Arthur Pendleton. The underwriter slammed the phone down, leaving Chloe entirely alone in the deafening, dead silence of her beautiful office. Marcus told me that according to the receptionist who later gossiped about it, Chloe actually dropped the phone on the floor and slumped completely limp into her chair. She looked around that spotless, luxurious space, and the absolute horror of the reality finally hit her. Everything she looked at, every single item, belonged to me. The walls belonged to me. The art on the walls belonged to me. The expensive scent in the air belonged to me. Even the structural steel materials and blueprint databases they needed to operate their business were completely mine. She had absolutely nothing. The massive shadow consulting firm she had set up to embezzle my funds was completely useless because there was no money left to steal. The luxury SUV parked in her exclusive reserve spot was entirely meaningless because she couldn't afford the massive monthly payments without her fraudulent salary. She was completely trapped inside a beautiful glass cage, and I was the only one holding the keys. She realized that every single arrogant decision she had made over the last 6 months had just been tightening a noose around her own neck. When she refused to invite me to the grand opening, she sealed her fate. When she called me demanding Phase 2 working capital and treating me like an automated teller machine, she guaranteed her destruction. She finally understood that my silent patience wasn't weakness. It was the calculated stillness of an experienced predator measuring the exact distance before making a final, lethal strike. Biauda, she couldn't call me to beg for forgiveness because she knew I had completely cut her off. She couldn't fix the massive supply chain collapse because the vendor she owed $120,000 to was actually me. She had nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. The brick wall she had just crashed into was made of solid concrete and ironclad legal contracts. The most terrifying part of her realization was that she now had to go face her husband. Julian was still out in the main lobby, desperately trying to salvage his ruined digital reputation after canceling on the tech mogul. He still thought this massive disaster was just a banking clearing error. He still thought his beautiful wife was a brilliant executive administrator. Chloe knew she had to step out of her office and look him in the eye. She had to tell him that they were completely broke. She had to confess that she had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars to fund her own vanity. She had to admit that his entire design practice, his client list, and his professional future now legally belonged to the father they both treated like garbage. And if she lied to him again, the alternative lenders would report her to the fraud registry, and she would face federal criminal charges. The absolute unified front of their shared greed was officially broken. The pressure of the financial trap was about to turn the two thieves completely against each other. I thanked Marcus for his exceptional work and hung up the phone. I set my cell down on the coffee table and leaned back in my chair. The sun had completely set, and the living room was bathed in the quiet, peaceful glow of the streetlights outside. For the first time since my wife passed away, I felt a true, deep, immense sense of peace. The painful, exhausting hope that my son would eventually learn to respect me was completely gone. In its place was the clean, undeniable satisfaction of absolute justice. I didn't need to scream, cry, or smash things to make my point. I simply used the brutal, mechanical rules of the real business world to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Phase 1 of the collapse was completely over. The illusion of their wealth was shattered, and the heavy chains of consequence were locked tightly around their throats. Now all I had to do was wait for tomorrow. I knew exactly what would happen when the sun came up. They would come to my estate. They would desperately crawl back to the man they discarded, completely unaware that the guillotine was perfectly suspended right above their heads. I stood up and walked into the kitchen to start preparing my dinner. I had a very busy day scheduled for tomorrow, and I needed to get some perfect rest to prepare for the final, complete dismantling of their fake empire. The next morning, just as the sun was clearing the tree line, the chaotic sound of tires violently tearing up the gravel of my driveway shattered the peaceful country morning. I was standing in the kitchen frying eggs, listening to the quiet sizzle of the cast iron skillet. I didn't need to look out the front window to know exactly who it was. The heavy, aggressive slam of two car doors echoed through the morning air, followed instantly by the thud of heavy, furious footsteps charging up onto my front porch. They didn't ring the doorbell, and they didn't wait for an invitation. The heavy brass doorknob was violently twisted, and the front door was shoved open with so much force that it slammed hard against the hallway wall. Julian and Chloe barged straight into my kitchen, bringing the cold, bitter air of their absolute panic right into my home. I took my time turning off the stove and wiped my hands on a cloth towel, completely ignoring their dramatic entrance. I took a moment to really look at my son, the glamorous architectural prodigy who wore custom suits and drank expensive champagne with local celebrities, was completely gone. Julian looked pathetic. His expensive designer shirt was wrinkled and completely untucked. His hair was a wild mess, and his eyes were filled with a terrifying, frantic exhaustion. It was obvious the man hadn't slept all night, watching his fake empire burn to the ground. Chloe stood right next to him, looking like a cornered animal. Her expensive makeup was heavily smudged, and the arrogant, condescending smirk she always wore around me was permanently wiped off her face. She was gripping a leather designer handbag so tight that her knuckles were completely white. Julian didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how I was doing. He immediately launched into a massive theatrical performance of emotional manipulation. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking from desperate panic. He demanded to know what exactly I had done to his design firm. He yelled that his entire high society reputation was totally ruined because that influential Silicon Valley giant had posted a viral takedown calling him an absolute fraud. He screamed that his office phones were ringing off the hook with wealthy clients desperately trying to cancel upcoming projects because they didn't trust him anymore. He aggressively pointed his finger straight at my face, accusing me of intentionally destroying his lifelong dream. He told me I was a bitter, jealous old man who couldn't stand to see his own son achieve real, modern success. He claimed that because I spent my life working in the freezing mud, renting cranes and pouring concrete, I secretly resented his glamorous career in high-end architecture. I stood there in absolute silence, letting him scream. I let him empty his pathetic lungs. When those accusations of jealousy failed to trigger any emotional response from me, Julian desperately reached for his ultimate weapon. He decided to use his late mother's memory to try to break my spirit. His voice dropped to a pathetic, dramatic whisper, asking me what my beautiful deceased wife would think if she could see me right now. He asked me how I could even look in the mirror, knowing I was actively destroying the only child she ever loved. He swore to me that if his mother were alive today, she would be absolutely disgusted by my cruel, unforgivable behavior. He told me she would have handed him that $150,000 Phase 2 funding without asking a single question, because she actually understood unconditional family love. It was an incredibly well-constructed emotional trap, specifically designed to make a grieving father collapse under massive guilt and immediately open his wallet. Months ago, those brutal words would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. I would have desperately apologized and handed over my life savings just to stop him from looking at me with so much hatred. But the father who blindly loved that boy died the exact day Chloe told me I wasn't invited to that grand opening. I looked at my son and felt nothing but cold, clinical pity. I saw him for exactly what he was. He was a weak, spoiled man, desperately exploiting a dead woman's name to try to get financial relief. When my continued silence drove Julian to complete madness, Chloe decided it was time for her to take control of the room. She aggressively stepped right in front of her husband, completely ditching the emotional manipulation tactics, and pulling out what she foolishly thought was a massive legal weapon. She puffed out her chest, trying to look as intimidating as possible. Pointing her perfectly manicured nail at me, she aggressively threatened to destroy me in court. She screamed that she had already spoken to a brilliant team of corporate attorneys. That was a complete lie, of course, as no reputable lawyer would touch her case. But she truly believed it sounded terrifying enough. She confidently announced that she was filing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for severe tortious interference. She aggressively accused me of illegally contacting her private commercial lender and intentionally sabotaging her emergency bridge loan application. She screamed that I had absolutely no legal right to speak to that alternative lending group or discuss her company's private financial matters. She claimed my actions were a highly illegal violation of corporate privacy and a direct, malicious assault on her livelihood. She threatened to drag my reputation through the mud, take my house, my truck, and every single penny of my retirement to compensate for the extreme emotional distress I had maliciously caused her. Chloe truly believed she was delivering a brilliant legal checkmate. She really thought throwing out a complex legal term like tortious interference would completely terrify an uneducated blue-collar fossil into instant submission. She demanded that I immediately call that alternative lender, apologize for my illegal interference, and formally waive my senior secured lien on the design firm's assets. She promised that if I signed the entire business over to her right now, she would graciously drop the massive lawsuit and let me walk away in peace. Listening to her ridiculous, delusional demands made me want to laugh right in her face. She was standing in my house threatening to sue me for protecting my own money from her massive embezzlement. She fully believed that if she just raised her voice and held a designer back, she could successfully bully a man who spent 40 years ruthlessly destroying cutthroat business competitors. I let my eyes move back and forth between the two of them. I saw Julian desperately clinging to his mother's memory, and I saw Chloe desperately clinging to her fake legal threats. They were like two drowning rats viciously biting at the only floating piece of wood left on the water, completely unaware that the wood was nailed securely to the ocean floor. They finally stopped shouting. Their chests were heaving as they desperately tried to catch their breath. The chaotic echoes of their screaming slowly faded into the corners of my quiet kitchen. They stood there, fully expecting me to finally break. They expected me to start crying, shouting, or desperately begging for their forgiveness. They expected the familiar, pathetic compliance they had trained me to provide for years. I calmly picked up my mug of black coffee and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, bitter liquid tasted absolutely perfect. I looked directly into my son's eyes, and I saw the first tiny spark of real fear begin to form in his pupils. It suddenly clicked in his head that the old man standing in front of him wasn't acting like a guilty father. My reaction was a brick wall. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match their chaotic panic. I simply asked them if they were completely finished throwing their little temper tantrum in my kitchen. Chloe gasped in shock, her face turning a bright, furious red. She aggressively opened her mouth to start screaming another round of fake legal threats, but I raised my calloused hand and shut her up completely. I kept my voice low, dangerously quiet, completely commanding the room with absolute authority. I told her that she wasn't going to say another single word in my house. I told her she was going to stand there and listen to exactly how the real world worked. The ultimate confrontation had finally reached its absolute boiling point. They had fired every single emotional and legal bullet in their pathetic weapons, and they had missed the target completely. They were completely out of ammo, and I was just getting started. I slowly turned around, walked out of the kitchen, and headed straight toward my private study. I knew they would follow me because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. It was time to drop a massive concrete anvil right onto their fragile glass castle. It was time to show them the folders. I walked out of the kitchen, my heavy work boots making a slow, rhythmic thud against the hardwood floors. I knew they were following me. I could hear their frantic, shuffling footsteps close behind. Julian and Chloe were completely quiet now. The absolute unyielding confidence in my posture had successfully choked the chaotic shouting right out of them. I stepped into my home study, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. This wasn't a warm family living room. This was a room built for ruthless business warfare. The walls were lined with heavy wooden bookshelves, packed with decades of complicated real estate ledgers and legal texts. The morning sun poured through the massive windows, casting a bright, unforgiving light directly onto my large mahogany desk. I walked behind it and slowly sat down in my heavy leather chair. Julian and Chloe stood awkwardly on the other side of the desk, looking exactly like two guilty children called into the principal's office. They fully expected me to start arguing with them. They were prepared for an explosive, emotional shouting match, where we violently traded insults until someone finally apologized. I refused to grant them the satisfaction of that emotional reaction. Anger is a completely useless emotion that only clouds your judgment when you are executing a perfect legal strangulation. I placed my calloused hands flat on the polished wooden surface of the desk. Sitting directly in front of me, perfectly arranged in a neat straight line, were three thick manila folders. I looked at my son. His arrogant posture had completely deflated. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other, utterly terrified of the absolute silence in the room. I reached forward and slowly opened the very first folder. I slid it across the smooth wood until it rested perfectly in front of him. I told him to take a good look at the documents inside. I told him it was the exact 120-page master financing agreement he and his wife had been so eager to sign at my dining room table months ago. Julian looked down at the paperwork, and I watched his eyes scan frantically over the complex legal terminology. I calmly explained the brutal reality of his situation to him. I told him that he had spent his entire adult life believing he was a brilliant, self-made architectural prodigy. He truly thought he owned a highly successful, high-end design firm. I shattered that beautiful illusion with a single sentence. I told him that the $1.2 million I gave him was never a generous family gift. It was a commercial loan with senior secured priority rights, and he actually didn't own a single piece of his own business. I pointed to the specific paragraphs detailing my massive lien over the entire practice. I explained that every single client blueprint, every piece of velvet furniture in the waiting room, and even the computer chips they used to render their graphics legally belonged to me. I watched the color drain completely from his face as he finally realized the massive legal chain wrapped tightly around his neck. Then I delivered the first fatal strike. I directed his attention to the strict default clauses buried deep within the contract. I explained that the restricted capital was legally mandated to be used exclusively for purchasing all engineering equipment and core raw materials outright, securing the collateral for the loan. I told him I knew exactly what he and his wife had done. I told him I knew they maliciously leased those surveying instruments and the structural steel, artificially keeping the cash to fund their own luxurious salaries. I explained that by intentionally leasing the equipment, they had completely violated core financial covenants and triggered an immediate, catastrophic default on that $1.2 million loan. Julian started to panic. He opened his mouth, trying to spin some desperate, pathetic excuse. He wanted to blame it on the supply chain or claim it was just a temporary business strategy. I raised my hand and shut him up instantly. I told him I wasn't interested in his lies because the truth was lying right there in the second folder. I reached forward and flipped open the second thick manila folder. I slid the massive stack of forensic accounting documents across the desk, completely covering the legal contract. I looked directly at Chloe. She stared down at those financial papers, and her entire body began to shake uncontrollably. She recognized the official bank logos printed at the top of the pages. She knew exactly what I was showing them. I didn't raise my voice, but my words cut through the quiet room like a razor blade. I told Julian that his brilliant chief operating officer wasn't just incompetent, she was a calculated, cold-blooded criminal. I explained that my legal team had executed a comprehensive forensic audit on the firm's main corporate accounts. I told my son to look at the long list of massive wire transfers highlighted in bright yellow ink. I explained that for the past several months, Chloe had been aggressively draining the operational budget into a completely fake shadow shell company called Aura Curations. Julian looked absolutely horrified. He stared down at the highlighted numbers, then looked up at his wife. He asked her what the hell Aura Curations was, his voice trembling with pure terror. Chloe couldn't even look him in the eye. She stared down at the floor, completely paralyzed by the massive, undeniable proof of her absolute betrayal. I answered the question for her. I told Julian that Aura Curations was a fraudulent shell company owned and operated entirely by his own wife. I explained that she had been billing his architecture firm tens of thousands of dollars every single month for completely fabricated marketing and consulting services. I pulled out her personal bank statements and spread them flat across the desk for him to see. I showed him where his corporate operating cash had actually gone. I pointed to the massive down payment for that matte black G-Wagon. I pointed to the thousands of dollars spent at high-end designer clothing boutiques and luxury weekend spa resorts. I explained that his empty staging yard yesterday wasn't because of some sudden, unexplained banking error. It was because his wife was intentionally starving his business just to fund her own endless vanity. She had completely ignored 2 months of critical vendor invoices, prioritizing her own fake consulting fees over the steel and concrete he desperately needed to finish the job. I told him that the massive social media PR disaster he suffered yesterday was orchestrated entirely by the woman standing right next to him. The absolute unified front of their shared greed completely shattered right before my eyes. Julian turned to Chloe, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized that she had intentionally destroyed his precious high society reputation just to buy expensive shoes and luxury cars. He started screaming at her, demanding to know how she could do this to him. He called her a thief and a liar. He completely forgot about the multi-million-dollar lawsuit she had threatened me with just 10 minutes ago. He completely forgot about his deceased mother. The only thing he cared about was the horrific reality that his wife had completely bankrupted his professional future. Chloe tried to desperately defend herself. She started crying and stammering, claiming she only took the money because she deserved a proper luxury lifestyle for managing such a stressful business. She tried to turn the blame back on Julian, saying he was always too busy playing the grand architect in front of local celebrities to ever look at the financial ledgers. They started viciously tearing each other apart right in my office. The pressure of the trap was crushing them, and they turned on each other like starving wolves. I let them scream at each other for a few moments, watching their toxic marriage completely disintegrate under the crushing weight of the truth. Then I picked up the third folder. The heavy thud of that thick manila folder hitting the wooden desk silenced them instantly. They both snapped their heads around to look at me, utterly terrified of whatever ultimate nightmare I was about to unleash next. I opened the final folder and slowly slid the official commercial foreclosure and asset seizure notices across the desk. I told them that the forensic audit was just the beginning of their punishment. I explained that because they had intentionally triggered the material default clauses in the operating agreement, I had officially exercised my absolute statutory rights as the primary senior secured creditor. I pointed to the top document and explained the brutal reality of their situation. I told them that I had completely seized full legal ownership of the architecture firm. I told them that the business no longer belonged to them on any level. I owned the office lease. I owned the intellectual property. I owned that expensive Italian marble desk. And I owned every single future client deposit. Chloe desperately tried to find a way out of the trap. She pointed a shaking finger at me, claiming through her tears that she was going to use the emergency bridge loan to pay off the material supplier and save the company. She told me the loan was already processing and that the cash would hit the account before the end of the day. I let out an incredibly cold, but entirely genuine smile. I told her she was completely delusional. I informed her that the alternative lending group had formally and permanently denied her fraudulent application yesterday afternoon. I explained that the underwriter had called my legal team directly because I was the registered senior lien holder on the state business registry. I told her that I personally instructed my attorney to inform the lender that she was attempting to illegally pledge leased high-tech equipment as commercial collateral. Chloe recoiled, as if I had just punched her directly in the chest. It finally clicked in her head that the terrifying phone call from the underwriter yesterday had been entirely orchestrated by me. She realized I had completely cut them off from every single financial resource in the city. Julian looked completely broken. His shoulders slumped, and the fire of his arrogance completely vanished from his eyes. He asked me, in a tiny, pathetic whisper, what happens next. He asked me how he was supposed to run his client meetings today with no materials and no access to the corporate bank accounts. I looked at my son and delivered the ultimate absolute consequence of his incredible arrogance. I told him he wasn't running any client meetings today. I told him he was never stepping foot inside that beautiful high-end office again. I explained that while they were busy driving over here to scream at me in my kitchen, my private legal team was currently standing inside his design firm with local law enforcement. The locks on those heavy glass doors were being completely changed. An official statutory notice of commercial foreclosure was being posted on the front windows for every wealthy client and local celebrity to see. I told them the game was completely over. The fake, glamorous life they built on my stolen retirement was officially and permanently terminated. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes to pack up whatever personal belongings they had in my house and get off my property, or I would call the sheriff and have them officially arrested for criminal trespass and federal commercial fraud. I closed the 3 emptied folders, completely ignoring their desperate sobbing. The absolute dismantling was complete. Watching the heavy reality of the commercial foreclosure notices completely crushed the last remaining ounce of fight in either of them. The beautiful glass castle they built with my money was gone. The fake empire was completely dead. But the absolute worst part of their nightmare wasn't losing the luxury custom design practice. The worst part was the second folder, which still lay wide open on my desk. Those comprehensive forensic accounting files were undeniable, ironclad evidence of federal wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Chloe stared at the bank statements, her eyes wide with pure terror. She knew exactly what happened to people who stole secured corporate funds and forged legal documents to obtain predatory loans. She was looking at a lengthy federal prison sentence. In that moment of absolute self-preserving panic, the shallow vows of her marriage completely evaporated. She didn't look to her husband for comfort or support. She turned on him like a cornered viper, completely desperate to survive. Chloe pointed a trembling finger directly at Julian, her voice screeching and high-pitched from extreme panic. She looked at me and frantically claimed that Julian knew absolutely everything about the Shadow Consulting Company. She swore to me that he had given her full verbal authorization to set up the fraudulent entity. She claimed that he was the one who told her to lease the expensive building equipment because he wanted to keep the cash reserves high to maintain their lavish personal lifestyle. She was completely making it up, of course. She was desperately trying to spread the massive criminal liability. If she was going down, she was determined to drag her husband into the deep, dark water with her. She shouted that Julian was the licensed architect and the primary owner on the corporate filings, so he was legally responsible for every single financial decision she made. She told me Julian was just plain dumb, and that he was more than happy to drive the luxury SUV and enjoy the expensive vacations she paid for with the stolen cash. She tried to paint him as the criminal mastermind while claiming she was just a loyal wife, following her husband's orders. Julian looked at his wife like she had just physically driven a knife straight through his chest. The golden boy of high-end architecture, the arrogant designer who truly believed he was completely untouchable, suddenly realized his own wife was actively framing him for a major federal felony. His face twisted into a mask of pure, absolute hatred. The shock rapidly mutated into a violent, explosive rage. He aggressively stepped right into her personal space. He screamed that she was a toxic, delusional parasite. He yelled that he had never authorized a single penny to go into her fake consulting company. He reminded her that he was the one working 14-hour days, dealing with demanding clients and building the brand, while she just sat in that imported marble office buying designer clothes online. He called her completely worthless. He said she brought zero value to the business and zero value to his life. He screamed that the only reason he let her pretend to be chief operating officer was because she wouldn't stop complaining about being bored at home, and he was sick of listening to her nag. He told her she was nothing but a glorified receptionist who had completely destroyed his entire future out of pure selfish vanity. The words he used were brutal and deeply personal. The thin, glamorous veneer of their high society marriage was completely stripped away, leaving the incredibly ugly, rotten foundation of mutual exploitation. They never loved each other. They only loved the money and the elite social status that the money provided. Now that the money was entirely gone, the status was permanently destroyed, and the police were actively changing the locks on their building. There was absolutely nothing left to hold them together. Chloe shoved him back hard and screamed right back into his face. Abandoning the innocent wife act entirely, she viciously mocked his reputation as an elite architect. She told him he was a pathetic fraud who only cared about getting invited to wealthy parties and taking photos with influencers. She let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, telling him that none of those high-net-worth Silicon Valley moguls ever actually respected him. She said they just used him for free blueprints and preliminary consulting, laughing at him behind his back. She screamed that he was a weak, spineless man who had to run to his aging father for startup cash because he was too incompetent to get a loan from a commercial bank on his own merits. Julian threw his hands up in absolute frustration, pulling violently at his own hair. He looked like a complete madman who had entirely lost his mind. He screamed that the second he left my property, he was going to hire the most aggressive criminal defense attorney he could find. He told her he would turn over every private email, text message, and financial password to federal investigators to prove she acted entirely alone. He swore to her that he would gladly testify against her in open federal court and happily watch her go to prison just to save his own architectural license. She laughed straight on his face, telling him he was incredibly stupid if he thought he could walk away from this wreckage clean. She reminded him that the fraudulent loan application she submitted yesterday, which was permanently flagged for severe commercial fraud, carried his forged digital signature. She told him that federal financial investigators would see his name stamped clear across that fraudulent application, and they would absolutely never believe he was just an innocent victim. She told him that because they were legally married, the authorities would completely freeze all their marital assets, including his personal bank accounts and the luxury apartment they lived in. She flashed an incredibly vicious, cruel smile and told him they were going down together, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. I just sat quietly in my heavy leather chair, watching their shared life suffer this spectacular, violent implosion. I didn't break them up, I didn't try to calm them down, and I didn't offer a single piece of parental guidance. I just kept my calloused hands folded on the desk, observing the chaotic destruction. This was the true cost of unearned comfort. This was the absolute consequence of treating people like disposable resources. When you build a relationship entirely on a foundation of greed and vanity, the slightest bit of pressure causes the whole structure to violently collapse, completely crushing everyone trapped inside. I thought about my late wife and the beautiful, solid marriage we built over 40 years. We built our life on mutual respect, deep loyalty, and quiet sacrifice. We survived financial hardships and terrible storms because we truly valued each other far more than money. Looking at my son and his wife, I realized they had absolutely no clue what real loyalty even looked like. They completely forgot I was even in the room. They paced back and forth in my private study, screaming awful, venomous accusations at each other. They tore each other to shreds with their words, leaving absolutely nothing sacred. I looked at the heavy brass clock on my desk, watching the smooth second hand sweep steadily across the face. The 10 minutes I had generously granted them were completely up. I slowly stood up from my chair. That simple movement caught their attention, and their chaotic screaming stopped instantly. They snapped their heads around to look at me, completely out of breath, their faces bright red from extreme rage and pure terror. A heavy silence flooded back into the room, covering us like a thick, dark blanket. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, steady pace of a man who had just finished a long, tedious day of work. I told them their 10 minutes were officially over. I pointed down the hallway toward the front door. I told them to get the hell out of my house. I told them to take their toxic, pathetic drama somewhere else and deal with the horrific criminal consequences of their actions on their own time. Julian looked at me, his eyes suddenly filling with desperate, pathetic tears. He took a tiny, tentative step forward toward my desk. He opened his mouth, trying to make one final plea, trying to reach the father who used to love him unconditionally. He desperately hoped I would save him from his wife, from the federal investigators, and from the absolute ruin he was currently facing. He wanted me to make the nightmare go away, just like I always did when he was a kid. I looked right through him, completely unmoved by his tears. I told him that the protective father he was looking for was dead and buried. I told him that the exact day he and his wife decided to treat my life sacrifices like a convenient ATM to fund their fake reality, they killed that man with their own hands. I told him that I was now strictly the primary senior secured creditor, and secured creditors don't offer emotional support or financial bailouts. I picked up my phone from the desk and gripped it tightly. I calmly informed them that if they didn't turn around and walk out that front door this exact second, I would dial the sheriff's department and have them physically removed for criminal trespass. The absolute cold finality in my voice completely shattered the last bit of resistance they had left. Julian slowly lowered his head. He looked completely hollowed out, his massive ego and fake prestige totally drained. He turned around and slowly walked out of the study, his heavy footsteps echoing down the long hallway. He didn't wait for his wife. He didn't hold the door for her. He abandoned her just as fast as she had just betrayed him. Chloe stood there for a few seconds longer, clutching that designer bag tight against her chest. She stared down at the 3 folders lying on my desk, the physical manifestation of her total destruction. It finally clicked in her head that her arrogant assumptions about my weakness were the most expensive mistake she would ever make in her life. She turned around and practically ran through the hallway, desperate to escape the crushing weight of her own failure. I stood alone in my quiet study, listening to the heavy front door slam shut. I listened to the separate sounds of their 2 luxury vehicles violently tearing down my driveway. They sped off in completely opposite directions, leaving behind a trail of dust and broken illusions. The thieves' unified front was permanently dismantled. They had arrived at my home together, fully expecting to easily bully an old man into submission. They left completely alone, in a state of absolute terror, knowing full well that their privileged life was totally over. The trap had executed flawlessly, and the absolute justice I sought was finally complete. After they drove away in their separate cars, I didn't stay in my quiet home. I walked out to my old pickup and drove straight toward Austin's high-end commercial district. I needed to witness the absolute final execution of my legal strategy in the real world. By the time I pulled up to that modern glass building, the gears of justice were already grinding their fake empire into powder. Marcus had coordinated the commercial seizure perfectly. A team of private security contractors and 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies were already standing in the beautiful lobby. A professional commercial locksmith was actively drilling out the heavy brass deadbolts on the glass front doors. Several high-net-worth clients who had scheduled appointments to discuss big-budget design contracts were standing on the spotless sidewalk, looking completely confused by the chaotic scene. Clutching their expensive designer handbags, they peered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the uniformed officers standing by the imported marble reception desk. These were the exact elite socialites my son had desperately tried to suck up to with free services. Now they were watching his glamorous architecture firm get officially raided by law enforcement. Julian and Chloe arrived at the building just minutes after I did. Their two luxury cars screeched to a halt in the reserved VIP spaces near the back entrance. They practically sprinted toward the building, desperate to somehow stop the inevitable collapse they had just learned about in my kitchen. But the heavy glass doors were already locked from the inside by the private security team. Julian slammed his fists against the thick glass, completely abandoning his polished, professional demeanor. He saw his high-net-worth clients staring at him from the sidewalk, and his face turned bright red from extreme humiliation. He tried desperately to flash his charming architectural prodigy smile, but he was sweating profusely, and his expensive designer shirt was still wrinkled from our intense confrontation. He shouted through the glass, trying to tell his clients that this was just a minor administrative glitch, and that his firm would be fully operational in a few hours. I signaled the security captain to crack the door just enough to let my son and his wife into the lobby. I wanted this absolute dismantling to happen right in the place where they built their massive lie. The second Julian stumbled into the room, he tried to take control of the narrative. He pointed at the uniformed deputies, aggressively demanding that they leave his private property. Marcus stepped forward from the shadows, holding a thick stack of official court-ordered foreclosure documents. He didn't speak softly. Marcus possessed a voice perfectly trained for boisterous courtrooms, and he used it flawlessly. He announced to the entire room, including the wealthy clients peeking through the open doorway, that the custom architecture firm had been officially and legally seized. He stated clearly that the seizure was due to severe commercial fraud and a total material default on a first priority senior secured loan. The wealthy clients outside let out a collective, sharp gasp. The carefully constructed illusion of extreme wealth and architectural prestige was completely and highly publicly shattered in a matter of seconds. The clients immediately pulled out their phones and started typing frantically, undoubtedly spreading the unbelievable scandal to every country club and elite social circle in the city. Chloe completely went into a panic. It suddenly hit her that if the entire building was completely seized, federal financial investigators would be tearing through her private executive office very soon. She knew her computer hard drives contained all the fake invoices and the digital bank records she used to embezzle my money. She desperately tried to push past the private security guards, sprinting down the spotless white hallway toward her office. She screamed that she needed to gather her private medical records and personal belongings, and that no one was allowed to touch her desk. A tall, uniformed guard effortlessly stepped into her path, blocking the hallway completely. Marcus looked at her with absolute disgust, calmly delivering the brutal legal reality. He informed her that absolutely every single item inside this building now belonged to the private holding company. He told her the commercial lien blanketed her computer, her physical filing cabinets, and the imported marble reception desk she used to hide her crimes. He explicitly warned her that if she attempted to touch a single piece of property belonging to the company, she would be immediately arrested for tampering with evidence and federal grand theft. Chloe recoiled, looking like Marcus had slapped her across the face. She looked around the extravagant reception lounge she had personally designed, realizing that in a building where she used to call all the shots, she was now a complete stranger. Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. I was standing against the back wall, watching the entire pathetic scene unfold, with a sense of absolute cold detachment. He walked slowly toward me, the look in his eyes completely pleading for a final shred of parental mercy. Dropping his voice to a pathetic whisper, he asked me how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. He told me I was completely humiliating him in front of the most important people in the city, destroying his only shot at a successful life. I looked at my son and felt zero pity. I replied that I wasn't the one humiliating him. I told him he had completely humiliated himself the exact moment he decided to fund his arrogant vanity with stolen money. I reminded him that he was the one who put his financial future in the hands of a greedy parasite because he was too busy taking photos with internet influencers to bother running a real, profitable business. I told him the destruction of his dream was entirely his own fault, and that I was just the man collecting the past due balance. The commercial locksmith finished installing the heavy new deadlocks on the front door. The uniformed sheriff's deputies officially informed the clients still on the sidewalk that all future design appointments and construction timelines were permanently canceled, and that they should look for another design firm. Those wealthy socialites walked quickly to their expensive cars, shaking their heads and whispering about the absolute disgrace of the Pendleton family business. Julian's professional reputation bled out right there on that polished white floor, and there wasn't a single PR stunt in the world that would ever patch it back together. Marcus reached behind the marble desk and pulled out 2 empty cardboard boxes. He walked over, handing one to Julian and one to Chloe. He told them that by law they were only permitted to take their personal car keys, their phones, and the coats they were currently wearing. He informed them in an incredibly stern tone that absolutely nothing else inside the premises was allowed to leave with them. Chloe tried desperately to grab a small, expensive decorative vase from a lobby-side table, claiming it was a personal wedding gift. The security staff stepped in immediately, firmly taking the vase directly out of her shaking hands and placing it safely back behind the reception desk. She wasn't allowed to take a single dime of my investment out of that building. Then came the final, ultimate humiliation of their exit. A uniformed sheriff's deputy stood on either side of my son and his wife, ordering them toward the exit in a tone that left absolutely no room for argument. Julian and Chloe walked slowly out of those beautiful glass doors, holding absolutely nothing but 2 empty cardboard boxes. The heavy new deadlocks let out a sharp, mechanical click that echoed loudly down the quiet street. They were officially and permanently locked out of their own fake reality. They stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely cut off from the luxurious world they had tried to steal. They had no design firm, they had no operating cash, and they were facing massive federal criminal charges for widespread commercial fraud. They didn't speak to each other. They just walked slowly toward their expensive rented vehicles, completely crushed under the weight of their own monumental greed. I stood inside the quiet lobby, looking around at the empire I had just legally conquered. The air conditioning let out a soft, gentle hum, pushing the scent of the expensive fragrance through the empty reception room. The building was dead quiet, but it finally felt clean. The toxic parasites had been forcefully removed, and the host was completely healed. The legal checkmate had been executed flawlessly, and my retirement was finally secure. I walked over to the premium bar where the champagne used to sit, poured myself a small glass of water, and raised a toast to the empty room. The lesson had been perfectly delivered, and the absolute truth had finally won. The weeks following the commercial seizure were a masterclass in the brutal, efficient operation of the legal system. I didn't need to get on the phone with my son or his wife to know exactly how their lives were falling apart. Marcus provided me with regular, detailed updates on the federal financial investigation and the civil bankruptcy proceedings. The complete dismantling of their fake empire was executed methodically, with a beautiful sense of permanence. Julian quickly discovered that the elite high society circle he had desperately tried to suck up to was completely unforgiving. The viral statement from that furious tech mogul had permanently poisoned his professional name. Not a single high-end design studio or real estate developer in the city would even consider hiring him. The wealthy socialites who used to drink his free champagne were now openly mocking him at their exclusive country clubs. His reputation was toxic, and the exact second he lost that imported marble lobby, his professional network abandoned him entirely. But the most terrifying reality Julian had to face was the massive mountain of debt slowly crushing him. Even though I had legally seized the firm's physical assets, The commercial drafting equipment and velvet furniture weren't nearly enough to offset the massive remaining balance on the $1.2 million loan. On top of that, federal authorities hit him with crushing fines for his severe compliance violations regarding the least high-tech surveying instruments. The state architecture board even threatened to completely revoke his license if he tried to file for personal bankruptcy to dodge the federal penalties. To avoid total ruin and keep his license, Julian was forced to take the only job a disgraced architect could find. He was forced to accept a grueling entry-level position for a severely underfunded municipal district in the far southern suburbs, a city building inspector. The contrast between his glamorous, fake past and his harsh new reality was absolutely shocking. He traded his tailored casual suits for a cheap, reflective safety vest. He could no longer spend his afternoons drawing high-end homes for local celebrities in a luxurious setting, smelling expensive fragrances. Instead, he spent 14 hours a day baking in the sun, smelling pressure-treated lumber and drywall dust, inspecting sloppy load-bearing walls and leaky pipes in crowded cookie-cutter housing developments. He made a tiny fraction of his old supposed salary. He worked non-stop overtime just to clear the heavy court-ordered minimum monthly payments he owed to my holding company. Marcus told me that Julian frequently walked out of the municipal offices at midnight, looking completely exhausted, carrying the absolute crushing weight of real, honest labor on his shoulders. He was finally learning the exact same brutal lesson I learned 40 years ago pouring wet concrete in the freezing rain. He learned that respect is earned through sweat and sacrifice, not bought with a stolen retirement fund. While Julian was busy learning the meaning of hard work, Chloe was experiencing a completely different kind of nightmare. Her lavish lifestyle vanished almost overnight. Federal investigators immediately froze all of her personal bank accounts, suspecting the funds were entirely the product of her massive embezzlement scheme. The matte black G-Wagon was repossessed directly from her driveway by the dealership because she completely missed 3 consecutive monthly payments. She was forced to trade her expensive designer heels for cheap flats just to ride the city bus across town. The lavish weekend spa trips and imported jewelry were gone forever, replaced by unpaid utility bills and non-stop aggressive calls from debt collectors. Chloe possessed absolutely 0 real marketable skills. Her fake consulting firm was completely dissolved by the state, and her resume contained nothing but a string of fabricated executive titles. Whenever she applied for a basic office job, hiring managers ran standard background checks and instantly discovered she was under an active federal financial fraud investigation. Nobody wanted to hire a woman who had actively embezzled tens of thousands of dollars from her own family. She quickly realized that the glamorous life she felt entitled to was never coming back. Because she was a creature made entirely of greed and self-preservation, she decided to completely abandon the sinking ship. She refused to lower her living standards to support a disgraced city inspector. Just 3 months after the company was seized, she officially filed for divorce. She hired a cheap, desperate divorce attorney, fully expecting to extract a massive financial settlement from Julian. She truly believed she could legally split his remaining assets down the middle and demand permanent alimony based on his future potential earnings as a licensed architect. She walked into that small, cramped divorce mediation room with her head held high, wearing her last clean designer suit, fully expecting to leave as a wealthy victim. She sat across from my son, still foolishly believing she was the smartest person in the room. She had completely forgotten about a quiet dinner we all had exactly 5 years ago, right before their wedding. During that dinner, I told Julian, in no uncertain terms, that I would absolutely not pay his incredibly expensive Ivy League tuition unless he secured his future assets with an ironclad prenuptial agreement. I had Marcus personally draft that legal document. It was a brutal, comprehensive contract, specifically designed to protect my financial investments from any future spouse. 5 years ago, Chloe couldn't sign that prenup fast enough because Julian was promising her a lifetime of endless wealth, and she didn't care about the dry legal details at the time. As she sat in the mediation room, confidently demanding spousal support, Julian silently pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase. He was completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes from working 14-hour days, but he still found the strength to deliver the final, fatal blow. Without saying a word, he slid the original, signed prenuptial agreement across the table. Her lead divorce attorney picked up the document and quickly scanned the clauses. The color completely drained from the lawyer's face. He turned to Chloe and instantly told her the horrific truth. The contract explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce triggered by financial fraud, criminal negligence, or major financial mismanagement, she was legally entitled to absolutely nothing. The prenup specifically and securely insulated all business assets, all future professional earnings, and all personal property from being divided. Chloe started screaming at her attorney, demanding that he fight the contract in court. The lawyer calmly packed up his briefcase and told her the document was absolutely airtight. He told her that with her currently under federal investigation for embezzling funds from the marital business, no judge in the state would void this agreement to hand her a payout. He told her she was completely wasting his time and walked straight out of the room. She was left entirely alone at the table. She wasn't getting a single dime of alimony. She wasn't getting a piece of Julian's meager city salary. She was legally stripped of everything she had ever touched. She walked out of that mediation room onto the cold city street with absolutely nothing. No money, no car, no husband, and zero future. The arrogant woman who used to openly mock my worn clothes and proudly lock me out of her grand opening was completely ruined. The justice I demanded wasn't just loud, it was incredibly precise. Her total and absolute dismantling was complete, leaving her to fade away into the exact same shadows she had tried to push me into. With the toxic parasites permanently removed, my beautiful glass building sat quietly vacant for 2 full months. The heavy new deadlocks kept the expensive imported Italian marble and high-tech drafting workstations safely locked in the dark. A weak man might have simply sold the entire property at a massive loss just to wash his hands of the situation and escape the painful family drama. But I am not a weak man, and I am absolutely not a man who accepts financial losses. I am a commercial real estate developer. When a building catches fire, you don't abandon the land. You clear away the charred rubble. You pour a solid new concrete foundation, and you build an even more indestructible fortress in its place. I owned a fully built-out, state-of-the-art commercial space, perfectly wired and ready for immediate operation. I owned the building lease. I owned the expensive velvet furniture. And because I legally absorbed the supplier debt, I owned every single high-tech instrument inside those walls. I just needed to find the right people to turn my distressed asset back into a high-performing investment. I called Marcus and gave him very specific instructions for finding new tenants. I told him I didn't want any arrogant, established architects who cared more about social status than actually building projects. I wanted the exact opposite of my son. I wanted young, hungry, first-generation professionals. I wanted people who actually understood the crushing weight of student loans and knew the value of an honest dollar. In less than 3 weeks, Marcus found the perfect match. He introduced me to 3 young, incredibly talented Latino brothers. They had just graduated at the absolute top of their class from architecture school, but they were buried under a mountain of unforgiving student loans. They were working grueling, mind-numbing shifts at a massive corporate drafting mill because they lacked the millions in startup capital needed to launch their own private practice. They couldn't afford premium commercial space in an elite district, let alone top-tier equipment. I arranged to meet them at the empty design center on a bright Tuesday morning. When I unlocked the heavy glass doors and flipped on the bright lights, they stepped into the spotless lobby with expressions of pure awe. They ran their hands over the Italian marble reception desk, looking at the expensive ambient lighting, almost afraid to touch anything. When I showed them the private offices equipped with the absolute latest design technology, they looked like starving men who had just been invited to a royal banquet. We sat down in the beautiful executive office, the exact room where Chloe had desperately tried to threaten me with a fake lawsuit. The three young architects sat across from me nervously, fully expecting me to propose an incredibly predatory financial arrangement. They knew they had zero leverage and were absolutely desperate for a break. I didn't exploit their desperation. I placed a standard, fair commercial lease agreement on the marble table. I offered them a completely turnkey operation. They could take over the fully furnished high-end design studio immediately and use every piece of state-of-the-art machinery to take on their own clients. In exchange, they just had to pay me a strict, flat monthly commercial rent. I didn't ask for a percentage of their future profits, and I absolutely did not demand any executive control over their daily business operations. I just wanted a reliable, secured return on my initial investment. The young architects read the contract, and they were completely overwhelmed with genuine gratitude. They didn't roll their eyes at the legal paperwork. They didn't demand expensive luxury cars or a complimentary champagne bar. They couldn't sign the commercial lease fast enough, shaking my calloused hand with a deep, incredibly sincere respect. They looked at me not as an irrelevant old man, but as a generous, silent partner who had just handed them the absolute keys to their professional future. They gave me the genuine respect that my own flesh and blood completely refused to provide. Just 2 months later, that high-end design center was completely reborn. It was no longer a shallow vanity project designed to impress internet influencers and wealthy socialites. It became a highly profitable, highly efficient commercial operation run by three dedicated professionals who truly cared about the quality of their work and the needs of their clients. They changed the company's registered name. They completely removed the ridiculous champagne bar and took meticulous care of the expensive equipment. They worked honest, long hours and built a flawless reputation based on real design talent rather than fake social media marketing. On the first day of every single month, I sit in my quiet home study and open my laptop. I don't have to chase down past due payments, and I don't have to listen to arrogant excuses about delayed wire transfers. I just watch that substantial corporate rent check automatically clear into my primary bank account. That monthly rent completely replaced the retirement fund my son and his wife tried to steal from me. My financial future is absolutely secure, and the heavy burden of trying to buy family loyalty with money is gone from my shoulders forever. The sun shines brightly through my study window, warming the heavy mahogany desk where this entire war took place. I don't hold any lingering anger toward Julian or Chloe. I don't care what they are doing, and I don't care where they are currently living. In my world, they simply no longer exist. I reach forward, pick up my mug of warm black coffee, and take a slow, deep sip. The house is completely quiet, but it's no longer that lonely, deafening silence. It's the calm, satisfying hum of a perfectly oiled machine executing its intended purpose. The massive ledgers are finally balanced in full. The brutal lesson has been permanently delivered, and the absolute truth is still standing tall. Did you like the final ending to my story? Let me know what you think about the brutal legal trap I used to protect my life savings. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice and survival. Thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next life story.